When I first started the divorce process, I felt very distraught, very upset. This was not supposed to happen to me. Catholics didn't divorce. It was very tough to accept that decision that had to be made after all those years.
I actually was raised like many Catholics, believing that marriage was forever. And I wanted to make sure that my love for my faith and my love for God was strong enough that I was going to give it everything I could give it before giving up on the marriage.
I think that men or women who go through divorce, they end up in the same place. They may have different emotions, but they end up divorced and Catholic.
In preparation for marriage, the priest had talked about your marriage being a reflection of God's love. And I realized that a perfect love for God even is when you love him back. And I wasn't being loved back by the man I had married, nor was I a reflection of God's love. My marriage was not a reflection of God's love for anyone that witnessed what the relationship was like, and most importantly, my son.
For a long time, it was difficult for me to understand my circumstances. It was like sand through my fingers. My husband didn't hit me. I had no bruises. I had no wounds, no scars. But over time, what I realized was that the unhealthy marriage that I was living in really was an abusive marriage, that the hostility, the resentment, the anger, all these underlying emotions, the distance, the avoidance, were all as bad as physical abuse, and that I had been suffering from that for years. And then I began to watch my children become victims of that. And I think that's when I finally realized that, in a sense, I was at the point of needing a last resort, but also that it was okay because I had tried everything that I could. I didn't give up on the marriage. I tried. From my perspective, I tried to help my husband. I tried to do what we could as a couple. And I realized that these were no longer things that I had any control over, that I could change.
I do very much remember feeling a sense of loneliness, of really not having a place in the church, and being very uncertain as to how the church viewed me as a divorced Catholic, whether I was accepted, whether I had a role, whether I still could participate in the sacraments, whether somehow my status had changed. I mean, it had changed. I was now a civilly divorced person who was Catholic, but grappling with the issue of what my role was and how I could I still contribute and be involved in my faith in the same way was confusing.
I knew very little about annulment. My perspective was that an annulment was reserved for very, very few special, rare circumstances. And it never really occurred to me that my circumstances might even fit within those parameters. I didn't know what the parameters were, but I assumed in my own mind that whatever it was that I was going through in my situation in my marriage could not possibly be a situation that might even be considered for an annulment.
When I first learned about it, I didn't like it at all because it felt like an indictment on my marriage, and pursuing something that would call my marriage invalid, given the fact that I entered into my marriage wholly and completely loving my spouse with all my heart, was challenging for me. It was difficult for me to reconcile my love for her and pursuing calling my marriage invalid, even though we were well on our way to getting a civil divorce.
You know, my initial thought was that I wanted to do it and I wanted to do it quickly. I just had this feeling that I wanted to make things right. Somehow my church still saw me as married. I wasn't, and there was a real disconnect there, and a little bit of anger about that. And so my thought was, I'm going to do this, I'm going to show them that, you know, I'm not married anymore. And I began the process, but I stopped because I realized that I wasn't doing it for the right reasons, that God was going to call me in His time to explore this opportunity in the way that He wanted me to explore it, not to prove a point to anybody.
I find it very difficult to accept annulment at this point still, because I myself don't feel, or I feel like I made the vow with God and with my husband, and therefore it cannot be annulled because the vow is there. Though I understand that if my husband didn't do it with that same intention, then our marriage wasn't valid.
I didn't understand the annulment process at all, really. I did understand that it was something I would need to do if I wanted to be remarried in the Catholic Church, and that just by that nature I knew it was something that I would explore, certainly. The very few things I had heard about it was that it was long, arduous, it could be very painful, none of which sounded particularly attractive to me at the time. And yet it was one of those things that I knew I would probably end up at least exploring.
When I learned more about the annulment process, I realized very quickly that if your marriage is not at a point where reconciliation is possible, that going through the annulment process is part of the healing process, and it's absolutely necessary to move on with your life. For people who are just beginning this process and have questions about annulment, I think it's absolutely important to get those myths and misconceptions dispelled, and when there are issues and concerns that you have, to seek out a priest, a deacon, or a lay person in the church to answer any questions. It's a complicated process, but it's a necessary one for you to move on with your life.
I believe for a lot of Catholics, we've heard a lot of horror stories with regard to the annulment process. And I believe there's a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of misconceptions about what a Catholic annulment is about. For me as a pastor, I've found working with couples and individuals going through the annulment process that it was a healing process for them. It was letting go of the past, being able to take that next step in their life to embrace, once again, the vocation of marriage.
The church recognizes that and tries to bring about a healing sacramentally by turning around and saying, you all did not enter into a marriage, not invalidly or validly, but you didn't enter into it sacramentally. And so what the church then has is the annulment process to bring about a complete healing of the parties involved, so that there's a better understanding of their Catholic faith and a better understanding of what true marriage is supposed to be and how the parties enter into a valid sacramental marriage. It's to restore that and to heal the people who have gone through just a tremendous hurt. So the church recognizes that this is a way to look at the circumstances of the marriage at the time the parties entered into it.
Well, I'm actually very excited about engaging in the annulment process. I've only just started. I've submitted my paperwork. I've heard a lot of stories since my initial exploration into annulment where I hear people having tremendous healing from the annulment process, that it's something that really made them understand what their marriage was about and what marriage should be about. I think there's going to be a lot of peace in really giving some concerted time and thought and effort into exploring my marriage and in a thoughtful, Christ-centered way.
The church looks at whether there was valid consent at the time that the parties entered into the marriage. The church also looks at the relationships of the individuals and what was the pressures going on and why they got married at the time they chose to get married. Again, it doesn't invalidate the civil ceremony. The civil side of the marriage, the church still recognizes that you were in a valid civil marriage. And the children from that marriage, oftentimes you hear that, oh, our children are now illegitimate. No, not the case at all. What happens is that, again, it just looks at the circumstances of the marriage from a sacramental perspective and tries to bring about that healing through that process.
I would say that it was really, really difficult, but it was absolutely healing. Absolutely healing. Because I remembered things and motivations and things that I probably would have never considered. And I have so much of a better understanding about what a real sacramental marriage is as a result of exploring the choices and decisions that I had made previously. I would say absolutely do it.
Everyone says an annulment is a healing process, and I thought I could never, how much more healing can I get? And I started the process, and now that I'm through the process, I can't believe the peace and healing that has come because of the understanding of what happened in my life, what happened in the marriage, how I got to be at this place, and what God's plan is for me. And now I can't believe the peace and understanding that has touched me, and I hope that others will be able to find that same peace and understanding that the annulment process has given me.